Hey y'all, and welcome to a different kind of tutorial. I've had some people ask me what the thought process is behind some of my buildings and techniques, so today I'd like to get a little more into detail than my usual videos. So here we have this very famous kill box by a YouTuber called Francis John. If you haven't looked him up already, I'd highly recommend you do, but I figure a lot of you have. This kill box here is designed around the principle of getting as much firepower as possible downrange. This works really well in general. Your raid comes in, your people shoot them. That's it. As long as you have enough firepower going downrange, you will defeat the enemy with minimal injuries. The thing is though, this kill box can be improved. I know, it's a big thing, right? Like, oh god, I'm questioning the God King of RimWorld. Hear me out. While this kill box certainly excels at firepower, something it is missing is alternate types of damage. It's solely focused on your shooters putting damage downrange. I got to thinking, there's so many other ways to do damage in RimWorld, so why not incorporate some of those? And that's how I came up with this little itty bitty tiny super deadly kill box. Its design is about as simple as I could get it. It's a 5x5 box with a long maze that leads up to it. And although it's very small, it's got a lot of engineering built in. Let's talk about the 5x5 box first. The small size means that only 1 or 2 enemies can attack you at a time. The little 3x3 box defensive structures give place for 4 shooters to stand with almost perfect cover, in addition to 3 more melee fighters, who can both melee block to prevent raiders from coming in, and also do a lot of melee damage very quickly. The lamp, of course, improves the ability to hit by giving your pawns light to see by, and then the little bit of roof that's above the main kill box actually prevents weather effects and outside factors from affecting, again, shooting in melee. What you end up with is a couple raiders that can come through at a time, and then you create this 7-on-1, 7-on-2, 7-on-3 scenario. In other words, you're really balancing the odds in your favor. Now let's talk about one little note about the roofing. I've actually got roofing on the main part where all the shooters and the melee fighters are, but I actually remove roofing on the sides because if you put any like fire traps in this box, there's going to be a lot of heat coming up through the main maze, and you don't want that to roast your people alive. So what you do is you create a small vent on each side to make sure that no heat actually gets trapped, that there's just enough space unroofed that your people will be safe. The next thing that we want to talk about. I use blasteel doors because yeah, they're a little more expensive, but it's worth it to make sure that people don't break in case, one of your colonists is running in there kind of late, trying to get to the defenses, and then you have raiders right on their tail. They're not going to bust that door down and completely ruin all your defensive structure. The next thing, why do I have plasteel walls? Seems a little overkill, except that your shooters, some of the time, are going to miss and hit those walls, and the last thing you want is for them to go down and then to create a worse matchup for your colonists, going from like 7v1 or 2 to 7v4 or 5. You wouldn't want that. That about covers the 5x5. Now we want to talk about the maze. You have these walls and these doors and these fences that cannot be burned. However, you have hay flooring because it is the most flammable floor that can ignite at the drop of a hat, which is exactly what you want. So you have doors in the central line to access traps without tripping over them. And then you have everything roofed over to make sure that heat does not escape, to build up crazy temperatures very fast, or to keep toxic gas in, what have you. And then you have decent doors at the exits, so it keeps them trapped for longer and it protects your people again, just in case one of your people happens to go through there and raiders close on their tail trying to beat the door down. If you notice, we have at the very end of the maze, we have a fence right on the entrance. Now why do we have that? That is to help prevent pawns from taking cover, and the floor is still flammable underneath, which means if someone does take cover there, they ignite on fire. Now, the next thing that you might have seen is these turret separators. This is actually a cool trick I learned from Adam vs Everything, another YouTuber who's pretty cool, you should definitely check out. It's not 100% reliable, but these turrets can actually help to destack these raiders so that they come in politely one at a time into your maze, which is really very powerful because instead of getting rushed all at once, again, you're creating these matchups where you're 7 versus 1 instead of like 10 versus 1 if they're all stacked. Now, before I go any further, make sure you zone your pawns properly so that they don't put themselves in danger. And now we get to my favorite part, the traps. The first kind of traps you can use, obviously, is fire. Fire is good against every kind of organic, whether it be wasters, Edakeen, baseliners, heck, even imps are vulnerable to enough fire. You put these traps on either side of the center line, and that allows you to access everything without stepping on them yourself. What you get is, in a few moments, you can get up to 400 C, all the way up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. And the other traps you can put in there is tox traps. You can stack the fire traps with the tox traps. You can use fire, you can use tox, whatever. But I like to use them in conjunction because fire causes pain. Heat stroke reduces consciousness. Tox gas also introduces pain. And then also toxic buildup reduces consciousness. So you have all of these effects working together to create severely weakened raiders that then go to your 7v1 matchup that, yeah, you're going to win that pretty much every time. Again, it's all about the matchup. Another trick you can use once your raiders actually get to the kill box is the focus fire. You take your 3 pawns, your melee pawns, and you get them all to focus on one enemy at a time. You get your shooters, all 4 of them, and you get them to all focus on one enemy at a time. Saves you a lot of time and focuses your damage to give you yet another advantage. Something I want to mention about this specific setup is the melee blocking. Sometimes raiders do come in stacked. Sometimes fire causes them to restack after they've been destacked. So what you want to have is 3 melee pawns who are up front who can block that front gap and keep that safe. So that way the enemy doesn't break and get into your backline. I've seen these guys handle as many 10 pawns at once. I don't know what the exact upper limit is, but again, that's what you have the destackers for. You try to keep it to no more than, a few pawns at a time. The next thing I'd like to cover is about protecting your pawns. Now, you don't really have an issue with friendly fire. You almost never see friendly fire, even with the back line to the front line. Now, that said, there's other things that can harm your pawn. You're looking at things like fire, mostly. So, say you get something in there that starts igniting, a Molotov cocktails, a flamethrower, what have you. Having 1 or 2 fire foam pop packs handy can coat all of your people in fire resistant foam and also put out anyone who is on fire, allowing you to get right back into the fight. I really just recommend having a fire foam popper or 2, having a psychic lance of some sort, whether it be psychic shock or insanity. Of course, you definitely want shield belts on your front line. Another thing that really helps is if your melee warriors are psychic immune. If you have the biotech DLC, you can give your warriors that gene, and it makes sure that if anyone has psycast in the back line, the front line isn't going to be affected, which means you can cast things like Vertigo Pulse or even Berserk Pulse on the front. Now the next thing I want to talk about is outside defenses. So you have this 5x5 kill box that's very heavily armed and armored. Then you have this maze that's very difficult to make it through, which utilizes various tactics to try to weaken your enemies, or even down them outright. And then finally, the third layer of defense that you can put on this is a minefield. I like to set the explosive traps up so they don't overlap. So that way when your raiders unstack, they all step into it and they all blow themselves up, and you really maximize your damage that way. Another trap type I like to use is Tox. It spreads over a wide area, and again, if people are spread up, lining up nicely to try to get inside, this is going to affect a lot of people with very little material. If you're lucky, enough of this will even down your enemies before they get to you. If you can take out a significant portion of your enemies before they even get to you, that's always an advantage. A properly set up set of IED traps, and even fire traps and Tox, that can take out as much as 10-20% of a raid before they even get to the maze. When you think about it, you only need to down about 50-60% of a raid, so taking out 10-15% before they've even touched your main defenses is very significant. Every bit counts. All that said, here's some considerations. Close range does carry some risk, especially for cowards, but that risk is pretty low, which is why, again, I'm very partial to this. You have this raid, it's a 10,000 point raid. We've defeated it with barely any injuries. In fact, I think we took about 15 damage total to all 7 of our pawns. It's not perfect, right? But you gotta consider, that's pretty damn good. The kill box does have to be rearmed periodically. Small downtime leaves you vulnerable. However, this can be solved by having a second copy of the kill box on the other side. Again, not too expensive, doesn't take up too much space, and now you've got twice the defenses that you had before. So while one is being used, the other can be rearmed, and so forth. Putting a single turret in the corner will help make sure your enemies path to your kill box. I've noticed that sometimes they seem to path just towards the light, or if you have an animal that's zoned there, that works, but I like to have a turret there just to be sure. This is a cheap and effective kill box. For its extremely low cost, it really punches above its weight. If you have a really big, fancy, beautiful kill box, like your Francis John kill box, you have, I don't know, something else with a bunch of bigger turrets that you really just, you're proud of it, it's expensive, it's good. This is a good kill box to have in case there's some downtime, like you've been through a big raid, stuff needs repairs, stuff needs cleaning, and you don't have time because there's another raid coming. This kill box is great because it's so cheap and so effective that it can be a good backup for your bigger kill boxes, your bigger and more expensive projects. Oh wow, look at that. A lot of survivors. I'm sure they wouldn't mind parting with some kidneys, right? Spoiler alert. They did. So there you go. You got a cheap, pretty effective kill box that isn't too hard to build, isn't too hard to remember. I'm not saying you have to use this. I'm just saying you don't always need the big, fancy, expensive stuff to do a lot of good. Again, we're taking out 10,000 point raids with 7 people. Anyways, it's good hanging out with y'all. I appreciate y'all coming by, and I'll see you in the next one. Or else.